The moment my sister Lauren called my engagement ring a piece of costume jewelry from a gas station vending machine, I knew our family dinner was about to become unforgettable. What she didn't know as she laughed and made jokes at my expense in front of our entire family was that the delicate rose gold band with its modest single pearl was actually our grandmother's most treasured possession, valued at $3.2 million by Sotheby's auction house just 3 months earlier. I watched her perform for our parents and relatives, mocking what she assumed was my fiancé's inability to afford something better, and I had to make a choice about whether to let her continue humiliating herself or to reveal a truth that would change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena Castellano, and I am 32 years old. I work as a restoration architect specializing in historical preservation in Boston, Massachusetts, a career that has taught me that true value often lies hidden beneath unremarkable surfaces, waiting for someone who knows how to look properly. On this particular evening in late September, I was sitting at my parents' dining room table in their home in Beacon Hill, surrounded by family members who had gathered to celebrate my recent engagement to Marcus Chan, a documentary filmmaker I had met 2 years earlier while working on a project to preserve a 19th-century maritime museum. The dinner was meant to be a joyful occasion. My mother, Victoria Castellano, had spent days preparing an elaborate Italian feast that filled the house with the scents of her bolognese sauce, fresh focaccia, and the lemon panna cotta that had been her signature dessert for as long as I could remember. My father, Robert Castellano, had opened several bottles of wine from his carefully curated collection, selecting vintages he had been saving for special family occasions. The crystal chandelier above the mahogany cast warm light over the carefully set table, and extended family members had traveled from as far as Connecticut and Rhode Island to join the celebration. Marcus sat beside me, his hand occasionally finding mine under the table, providing silent support as my family's dynamics played out around us. He had met my family several times over the past 2 years, so he was not entirely unprepared for what these gatherings could become, but I could sense his discomfort as the evening's tone began to shift from celebration to something more complicated and painful. Lauren, my younger sister by 4 years, sat across from us, her own engagement ring catching the light with aggressive brilliance. The 3-carat diamond that her fiancé Brandon had presented to her 6 months earlier was impossible to ignore, which was precisely the point. Lauren had made sure everyone knew exactly how much Brandon had spent, how he had worked with a private jeweler, how the setting was platinum, and how the clarity and cut were absolutely flawless. She had posted photographs from every conceivable angle on social media, included close-up shots of the ring in every image from the proposal, and managed to work its value into nearly every conversation we had shared since her engagement began. Growing up, Lauren had always been the sister who measured everything by its external appearance and monetary cost. While I spent my childhood fascinated by the stories behind old buildings and antique objects, Lauren was drawn to whatever was newest, shiniest, and most expensive. Our parents had indulged this tendency, perhaps because Lauren's enthusiasm for material things was easier to satisfy than my more abstract interests in history and craftsmanship. Throughout our childhood, Lauren received the designer clothes she demanded for each school year, while I was content with vintage pieces I found in thrift stores and estate sales. She got the new car when she turned 16 while I drove our grandmother's old sedan. She attended an expensive private college focused on business and marketing, while I earned scholarships to study architecture at a state university. The pattern had continued into our adult lives. Lauren worked in luxury retail management, a career that surrounded her with expensive goods and wealthy clients, while I chose a field that often meant working with limited budgets to preserve buildings that society might otherwise demolish. Lauren lived in a modern high-rise apartment in the fashionable Seaport district with floor-to-ceiling windows and designer furnishings, while Marcus and I shared a converted loft in a former textile factory in Somerville that we were slowly renovating ourselves. Lauren drove a new European sports car that she traded in every 2 years, while I still drove a practical used hybrid that got me where I needed to go. Our parents, particularly our mother, had always seemed more comfortable with Lauren's choices than with mine. Victoria understood wanting beautiful things, appreciating luxury, and presenting a certain image to the world. She struggled to understand my fascination with old buildings that needed saving, my preference for items with history over items with price tags, and my general indifference to the markers of status that seemed so important to her and to Lauren. My father was more accepting of my different path, but he rarely intervened when my mother or Lauren made comments about my choices. When Marcus proposed to me 3 weeks earlier, he had done so during a private moment at the Maritime Museum where we first met. There were no photographers, no audience, no elaborate public spectacle. Instead, there was just the two of us standing in the museum's restored navigation room at sunset, with the golden light streaming through the original glass, and Marcus telling me that he wanted to spend his life discovering hidden treasures with me. When he presented the ring, he explained that he had searched for months to find something that would honor both my aesthetic preferences and my family history. The ring he offered was delicate and unusual, nothing like the modern engagement rings that dominated jewelry store displays. The band was rose gold, slightly worn in a way that spoke to its age and history. Set into the band was a single Baroque pearl, its irregular surface glowing with subtle pink and cream undertones that shifted in the light. The pearl was surrounded by a halo of tiny seed pearls, and the craftsmanship of the setting showed the handmade quality of a much earlier era. To someone who understood antique jewelry, the ring was exquisite. To someone who only valued size and obvious sparkle, it might appear modest or even plain. What Marcus knew, but what I had not yet shared with my family, was that this ring had belonged to my grandmother, Elena Marchetti Castellano, for whom I was named. Grandmother Elena had passed away 18 months earlier at the age of 93, leaving behind a legacy of grace, intelligence, and quiet strength that had profoundly shaped who I became. She had been the person in my family who understood my interests, encouraged my unconventional choices, and taught me that true value had nothing to do with price and everything to do with meaning, craftsmanship, and connection to something larger than oneself. Grandmother Elena had been an extraordinary woman whose life story was far more interesting than most of our family realized. She had grown up in a wealthy Italian family with connections to European nobility, though she rarely spoke about that background. During World War II, her family had lost nearly everything, and she had immigrated to America with only a small trunk of possessions, starting over in a new country with limited resources but unlimited determination. She had met my grandfather, Thomas Castellano, at a community center in Boston where she was teaching Italian language classes while he was studying engineering on the GI Bill. Their marriage had been long and happy, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than material wealth. My grandfather had become a successful civil engineer, and they had lived comfortably but never ostentatiously. Grandmother Elena had worked as a translator, and occasionally as a consultant for museums and auction houses when they needed expertise on Italian art and artifacts. She had a brilliant eye for quality and authenticity, skills she had learned from her own family's collection before the war scattered it across the globe. Throughout my childhood, Grandmother Elena had been my closest confidant and greatest supporter. While my parents and Lauren focused on conventional markers of success, my grandmother taught me to see beauty in patina and age, to value craftsmanship over mass production, and to understand that the most precious things in life were often those that carried stories and memories. She took me to estate sales and taught me how to recognize quality. She showed me her small but carefully curated collection of family pieces that had survived the war, explaining the history and significance of each item. She encouraged my interest in architecture and preservation, understanding that my desire to save old buildings came from the same impulse that made her treasure objects that connected past to present. When Grandmother Elena died, she left specific instructions about how her possessions should be distributed among family members. Most of her estate went to my parents, including her home and financial accounts, but she had left personal letters for each of her grandchildren, and in mine she had included specific instructions about certain items she wanted me to have. Among those items was her engagement ring, the one her own grandmother had given her when she married my grandfather. The letter explained that this ring had been in our family for 5 generations, originally commissioned in 1875 by my great-great-great-grandfather for his bride. It had been created by a renowned Italian jeweler, whose work was now highly sought after by collectors. The Baroque pearl was exceptionally rare, harvested from waters that no longer produced such specimens. The craftsmanship of the setting represented techniques that modern jewelers could not easily replicate. But more importantly, my grandmother wrote, the ring represented a continuity of strong women who had chosen partners based on character rather than fortune, who had built lives of meaning rather than mere display. My grandmother had worn this ring every day of her married life until arthritis forced her to stop wearing jewelry altogether. In her letter, she asked that I wear it when I found someone worthy of joining our family's story, someone who would understand and appreciate its significance beyond its monetary value. She asked that I not tell my parents or Lauren about the ring's provenance or value unless circumstances required it, because she wanted me to discover whether I would treasure it for its meaning rather than its price. I had honored her request. When Marcus proposed, I had been genuinely surprised and deeply moved to see grandmother Elena's ring. I knew that Marcus had become close to my grandmother during the months before her death, visiting her regularly and listening to her stories about Italy, immigration, and building a life in America. What I had not known was that during one of those visits, my grandmother had given him the ring, along with detailed provenance documentation and an appraisal she had commissioned years earlier. She had told Marcus that if he truly loved me and intended to propose, this ring should be offered as a symbol of understanding what our family's real treasures were. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The appraisal documentation which Marcus showed me after I accepted his proposal valued the ring at $3.2 million based on its historical significance, the rarity of the pearl, the documented provenance spanning 5 generations, and the reputation of the original craftsman. Sotheby's had indicated strong interest in the piece should we ever wish to sell it, noting that collectors of antique Italian jewelry and natural pearls would compete aggressively for such a well-documented specimen. But neither Marcus nor I had any intention of selling the ring. Its value to me was entirely unrelated to what collectors might pay for it. This ring connected me to 5 generations of women in my family, to my grandmother's love and understanding, and to the values she had worked to instill in me throughout my life. Wearing it felt like carrying her blessing and her memory with me every day. The fact that it also happened to be worth millions of dollars was almost incidental to its real significance. I had not shared this information with my parents or Lauren because my grandmother had asked me not to unless necessary. I also knew that if Lauren understood the ring's monetary value, her reaction would focus entirely on the price rather than on the history, craftsmanship, or emotional significance. The test my grandmother had implicitly created was whether I would value the ring for what it truly was rather than for what it could be sold for, and I wanted to honor that test by keeping the commercial valuation private. So when my family gathered for this engagement dinner, they saw only what appeared to be a modest, old-fashioned ring that seemed inadequate compared to Lauren's aggressive diamond. My mother had raised her eyebrows when she first saw it but had been too polite to comment directly. My father had smiled and offered his congratulations without examining the ring closely. Various aunts, uncles, and cousins had offered warm wishes focused on the relationship rather than the jewelry. But Lauren, with her expert eye for luxury goods and her competitive relationship with me, had immediately fixated on the ring's apparent modesty. Throughout the cocktail hour before dinner, I had noticed her glancing at my hand, and I could see her mentally comparing my ring to her own enormous diamond. I knew the comparison was inevitable, and I had prepared myself for some comment, but I had hoped she might have the grace to keep her observations private. That hope dissolved about halfway through the main course, when the conversation had turned to wedding planning and Lauren decided to make my engagement ring the subject of public commentary. She had been drinking wine steadily throughout the evening, and the alcohol had removed whatever social filters might have restrained her competitive impulses. "So, Elena," Lauren said loudly enough to ensure everyone at the table could hear, interrupting a conversation our aunt was having about venue options. "I have to ask about your ring because I just cannot stop staring at it." I felt Marcus stiffen beside me and placed my hand over his under the table, silently communicating that I would handle whatever was coming. "What about it?" I asked calmly, though my heart rate had accelerated in anticipation of where this was heading. Lauren reached across the table and grabbed my hand before I could withdraw it, pulling it into the light to examine the ring more closely. "I mean, I know Marcus is in documentary films, which probably doesn't pay great, but seriously? Did he actually spend money on this? Or did it come from one of those vintage shops where you buy other people's old jewelry?" The table fell silent. Our mother made a soft sound of protest, but she did not actually tell Lauren to stop. Our father looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but I squeezed his hand, asking him silently to let me handle this. "It is vintage," I confirmed, keeping my voice level. It belonged to someone in my family. Lauren laughed, a sharp sound without real humor. Oh my God, you are wearing a hand-me-down engagement ring? Elena, that is so sad. I mean, I know you are into old things and whatever, but your engagement ring should be new, something your fiancé chooses and pays for specifically for you. Not some old ring that probably cost like $200 50 years ago. Lauren, that is enough, our father said, finally finding his voice, but his intervention was mild, more of a suggestion than a command. I am just being honest, Lauren continued, emboldened by the wine and by our parents' failure to shut down her commentary more forcefully. Brandon spent 3 months' salary on my ring because I am worth it to him. He wanted everyone to know how much he values me. But this thing? She gestured dismissively at my grandmother's ring. It looks like something from a costume jewelry collection. That pearl is not even round. Did you know you can get real pearls now, Elena? Perfectly round ones that actually sparkle? Baroque pearls are actually more rare and valuable than perfectly round pearls, I said quietly, though I knew the information would not penetrate her certainty about what constituted value. Sure they are, Lauren said with obvious skepticism. Look, I get that you and Marcus are going for some kind of bohemian vintage vibe or whatever, but you are going to be wearing this ring for the rest of your life. Don't you want something that actually looks expensive? Something you will be proud to show people? Marcus finally spoke, his voice tight with controlled anger. Elena is proud of her ring, Lauren. It has significant personal meaning to her, which is what actually matters in an engagement ring. Oh, personal meaning, Lauren said mockingly. That is what people say when they cannot afford the real thing. I am sure it is very meaningful that Marcus saved money by giving you used jewelry instead of buying you something new and actually valuable. I watched her perform, noting the way she kept glancing at our mother for approval, or at least acknowledgement of her points. This was not really about my ring at all, I realized. This was about Lauren's need to establish herself as superior, more successful, more valued. My unconventional choice threatened the narrative she had constructed about her own life, where expensive things proved worthiness and love could be measured in carats and platinum settings. Part of me wanted to end this immediately by revealing what she was actually mocking. I could pull out my phone and show her the Sotheby's appraisal, watch her face change as she realized she had just called a $3.2 million heirloom costume jewelry. The temptation to humiliate her the way she was attempting to humiliate me was strong, made stronger by the anger I felt at her dismissal of my grandmother's treasured possession. But another part of me, the part that my grandmother had cultivated through years of patient teaching, recognized this moment as an important choice. I could respond to Lauren's attack by escalating with information about monetary value, proving that my ring was better than hers by the same materialistic standards she was using. Or I could respond from a different value system entirely, one that my grandmother had spent her life trying to teach both Lauren and me, though only one of us had been listening. I looked at my sister across the table, seeing beyond her aggressive confidence to the insecurity that drove it. Lauren had always measured her worth by external validation, by price tags and brand names and other people's envy. She had never developed the capacity to value things for their intrinsic qualities, or their emotional significance. Our grandmother had tried to teach her these things, but Lauren had been bored by stories about history and craftsmanship, preferring to calculate the current market value of grandmother Elena's possessions rather than understanding their meaning. I thought about what my grandmother would want me to do in this moment. She had specifically asked me not to reveal the ring's appraisal unless circumstances required it, and she had worn this same ring through decades of marriage without ever discussing its monetary value with people who would not understand its real worth. My grandmother had known that she could end conversations about the modesty of her jewelry by explaining what it would sell for, but she had chosen not to, because she valued being understood by people who saw what she saw more than she valued being envied by people who only understood price. The entire table was watching this exchange now, waiting to see how I would respond to Lauren's public mockery. My mother looked deeply uncomfortable, but uncertain about whether to intervene on my behalf or maintain peace by allowing Lauren's commentary to continue unchallenged. My father appeared disappointed but passive. Marcus was barely containing his anger at Lauren's rudeness. Various relatives were studying their plates, embarrassed by the conflict but unwilling to insert themselves into what they saw as a sister dynamic. I made my decision. I would not respond to Lauren's attack by asserting the ring's monetary value, because doing so would validate her assumption that value and price were synonymous. Instead, I would respond from the framework my grandmother had taught me, speaking about meaning and memory and the things that actually mattered. If Lauren could not understand that perspective, the failing was hers, not mine. And if my parents and other family members witnessed Lauren's cruelty without recognizing how thoroughly she had misunderstood what she was mocking, that too would be revealing information about who understood my grandmother's lessons and who did not. But I also knew that this decision had consequences. If I did not defend the ring's worth in terms Lauren understood, she would continue to view my engagement as somehow lesser than hers. She would tell this story to friends and relatives as an example of her superior taste and her fiancé's superior generosity. She would use my apparent acceptance of a cheap ring as evidence that I settled for less because I could not command more. I could live with Lauren's misconceptions about my choices. What I struggled with was allowing her to disrespect my grandmother's memory and the significance of this family heirloom by dismissing it as worthless costume jewelry. The ring deserved to have its real value acknowledged, not its price, but its historical and emotional significance. "Lauren," I said carefully, keeping my voice calm and my expression neutral, "this ring belonged to grandmother Elena. She wore it every day of her married life until her arthritis made it impossible. It has been in our family for 5 generations, and she specifically wanted me to have it and wear it when I got engaged. The fact that you cannot see its value says more about your limitations than about the ring's worth." Lauren's expression flickered with something that might have been recognition that she had made a mistake, but the alcohol and her competitive drive pushed her forward despite that momentary hesitation. "Oh please, grandmother Elena had some nice things, but that ring is not one of them. I remember seeing her wear it, and I remember thinking even as a kid that it looked old and ugly. If she had anything actually valuable, she would have updated it or sold it and bought something better." The casual dismissal of our grandmother's aesthetic judgment and her deliberate choice to wear this ring for more than 60 years felt like a physical blow. I realized in that moment that Lauren had learned absolutely nothing from grandmother Elena's attempts to teach her about value beyond price, about meaning beyond market rates, about the difference between possessions that owned you and possessions that connected you to something meaningful. Marcus's hand tightened on mine, and I could feel him preparing to speak, probably to defend both me and my grandmother's memory. But before he could formulate his response, my mother finally found her voice, though her intervention was characteristically tentative and inadequate. "Girls, this is supposed to be a happy family dinner. Can we please talk about something other than engagement rings? Lauren, you have made your point about preferring modern jewelry. Elena, you have explained that your ring has sentimental value. Let us move on to discussing wedding dates and venues, shall we?" The attempted subject change was so obviously designed to protect Lauren from the consequences of her behavior, rather than to address the disrespect she had shown, that I felt my carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. My mother's response perfectly encapsulated the family dynamic that had existed throughout our childhood, where Lauren's bad behavior was quickly forgiven or redirected, while my different choices were tolerated, rather than celebrated. But what pushed me from restraint toward revelation was not my mother's predictable favoritism. It was the look on Lauren's face as our mother tried to change the subject. Lauren was smirking, clearly viewing the redirection as a victory, as evidence that she had successfully made her point about the superiority of her ring and her engagement without facing real consequences for the cruelty of her commentary. In that moment, watching my younger sister's self-satisfied expression as she prepared to move forward, having thoroughly mocked something precious to me and to our grandmother's memory, I understood what my grandmother had meant when she wrote that I should not reveal the ring's provenance or value unless circumstances required it. These circumstances required it. Not because I needed to prove anything to Lauren about monetary worth, but because I could not allow her to continue believing that she had the right to mock and diminish things she did not understand, that her ignorance entitled her to cruelty, that her value system was the only valid measure of worth. My grandmother would not have wanted her ring, her taste, her values, and her carefully cultivated relationships to be dismissed as worthless by someone who had never taken the time to learn what she was trying to teach. This was not about putting Lauren in her place through competition over whose ring cost more. This was about defending my grandmother's legacy and the principles she had lived by, principles that deserved to be articulated and honored, even if doing so made my sister uncomfortable. I reached for my phone, opening the secure folder where I had stored the documentation Marcus had given me after I accepted his proposal. "Before we change the subject," I said clearly, my voice carrying across the suddenly silent table, "I think there is some information about this ring that the family should know." The silence that followed my statement was profound and expectant. I could feel every person at the table leaning forward slightly, their attention fully captured by the promise of information that might explain the tension crackling through the room. Lauren's smirk had frozen on her face, uncertainty beginning to creep into her expression, as she tried to assess whether I was bluffing or whether she had genuinely miscalculated the situation. Marcus sat very still beside me, his hand warm against mine, offering silent support while allowing me to control how this moment unfolded. Before I revealed the documentation on my phone, I needed my family to understand the context of what they were about to learn. The appraisal and provenance documents would mean nothing without the story behind them, without understanding who grandmother Elena had been, and what she had been trying to teach us through her choices and her life. This was not simply about proving the monetary value of an object. This was about honoring a woman who had shaped my understanding of what mattered in life and who had tried, with varying degrees of success, to share those lessons with all of her grandchildren. I set my phone down on the table in front of me, the screen still dark, and looked around at my family. My parents sat at opposite ends of the long mahogany table, both of them looking confused and slightly apprehensive about what I might say next. My father's expression suggested he was beginning to suspect that he had missed something important about his own mother's possessions and intentions. My mother looked primarily concerned with maintaining social harmony and avoiding further conflict, her lifelong priority that had shaped so many of our family dynamics. Lauren sat across from me, her diamond engagement ring catching the chandelier light with its calculated brilliance, her face a mixture of defensive certainty and growing unease. She took another sip of wine, trying to project confidence, but I could see her fingers trembling slightly as she set the glass down. Beside her sat her fiancé Brandon, a man I barely knew despite his 6 months of dating my sister. He looked profoundly uncomfortable, clearly wishing he were anywhere else but trapped at a family dinner that had devolved into conflict over jewelry valuation. Around the rest of the table sat various members of our extended family. My father's brother Uncle James and his wife Aunt Patricia, who had always been kind to me and had appreciated my grandmother's European sensibilities. My mother's sister Aunt Caroline and her husband Uncle David, who had known grandmother Elena less well but had always been cordial. Several cousins in their 20s and 30s who were watching the drama unfold with the fascinated attention of people witnessing a conflict that did not directly involve them. I thought about how to explain decades of family history, relationship patterns, and carefully transmitted values in a way that would make sense of what I was about to reveal. The story of this ring could not be separated from the story of who my grandmother had been, what she had survived, what she had valued, and how those values had shaped her relationships with her children and grandchildren. Understanding the ring required understanding the woman who had worn it, and the choices she had made about what to preserve and what to pass forward. "I want to tell you about grandmother Elena," I began, my voice steady despite the emotion rising in my chest. Not the version of her that we saw at family dinners or holiday gatherings, but the person she actually was, the life she lived before she came to America, and what she was trying to teach those of us who were willing to listen. My father straightened in his chair, his expression shifting to something more attentive and vulnerable. I realized that I was about to tell him things about his own mother that he had perhaps never fully understood or appreciated, and that recognition created a moment of role reversal where the daughter became the keeper of family history that the son had overlooked. I explained that grandmother Elena had been born in 1928 in Verona, Italy, into a family of significant wealth and social position. Her father had been a successful textile manufacturer with factories throughout northern Italy, and her mother had come from a family with aristocratic connections dating back to the Renaissance. The family had lived in a palazzo that had been in her mother's family for 300 years, surrounded by art, antiques, and objects that represented generations of careful acquisition and sophisticated taste. Grandmother Elena had grown up in this world of beauty and privilege, learning from her mother and grandmother how to recognize quality, how to understand the difference between objects made with care and skill versus those produced carelessly for mere decoration, how to trace the provenance of paintings and furniture and jewelry, how to see the hand of the craftsman in the finished work. These were not merely aesthetic skills but practical knowledge that helped preserve family wealth and cultural heritage across generations. But this comfortable world had shattered during World War II. As the war progressed and Italy's position became increasingly precarious, Grandmother Elena's family had faced impossible choices about how to protect both themselves and the possessions that represented their family history. Her father had been killed in 1943 during the Allied bombing of their factory. Her older brother had disappeared during the German occupation, never to be found. Her mother had died of pneumonia during the brutal winter of 1944, when fuel and medicine were impossible to obtain. By the time the war ended, Grandmother Elena was 17 years old, orphaned, and living in a palazzo that had been damaged by artillery fire and looted by various occupying forces. The family business was destroyed, the family fortune spent or stolen, and the artworks and antiques that had filled the house were scattered. Most had been seized by retreating German forces or by desperate neighbors who took what they could during the chaos of the war's final months. What Grandmother Elena had managed to preserve was a single trunk of possessions that she had hidden in a secret room behind the palazzo's library. In that trunk, she had placed items of personal significance rather than maximum monetary value. Photographs of her family, her mother's recipe journals, a few pieces of jewelry that had belonged to her grandmother, chosen not because they were the most expensive pieces but because they carried the most meaning. Several small paintings and drawings by family friends who had been artists, books that had been annotated by her father, letters that told the story of her family's history. Among the jewelry pieces in that trunk had been this engagement ring, which her grandmother had worn and which had been given to Grandmother Elena on her 16th birthday with the understanding that she would wear it when she married. The ring had been commissioned in 1875 by her great-grandfather for his bride, my great-great-great-grandmother Sophia, who had been considered a great beauty but who had chosen to marry for love rather than advantage, selecting a successful merchant rather than the aristocratic suitor her family had preferred. The ring's design reflected the romantic aesthetic of that era, while incorporating elements that made it distinctively individual. The Baroque pearl at its center was extraordinary, harvested from the waters near Sardinia during a brief period when such pearls were being discovered in that region. Unlike the perfectly round cultured pearls that would dominate the market in later decades, this Baroque pearl had an organic, irregular shape that gave it character and uniqueness. The subtle pink and cream tones that moved across its surface were the result of natural nacre formation, creating an iridescent quality that no modern technique could replicate. The setting surrounding the pearl had been created by a master jeweler in Venice whose work was now highly prized by collectors. The craftsman had used a technique of hand-forming the rose gold band and setting the tiny seed pearls in a halo pattern that required extraordinary precision and skill. Each seed pearl had been individually selected and placed, creating a subtle gradation of size and tone that drew the eye toward the central Baroque pearl. The underside of the setting bore the craftsman's mark, a small impressed signature that authenticated the piece and connected it to a documented body of work, now held in museums and private collections. This ring had passed from Sophia to her daughter, then to her granddaughter, and finally to Grandmother Elena. Each woman who wore it had been told its story, had understood its significance as a symbol of choosing love and character over wealth and status, had valued it for what it represented rather than what it could be sold for. The ring had survived war, immigration, financial hardship, and changing fashions because each generation had recognized that its worth transcended market value. When Grandmother Elena left Italy in 1949, she carried that trunk of preserved possessions with her to America. She had used the last of her family's remaining assets to purchase a single ticket on a ship to New York, arriving in the country with no money, no connections, and no prospects beyond the determination to build a new life. The trunk of family treasures came with her, representing everything that remained of the world she had lost. I explained to my family how Grandmother Elena had met our grandfather, Thomas Castellano, at a community center in Boston where she was teaching Italian language and cooking classes to support herself while learning English. Grandfather Thomas had been studying civil engineering on the GI Bill after serving in the Pacific during the war. He had taken her Italian class because he was interested in the language and culture, and he had fallen in love with the graceful, cultured young woman who could discuss art and history and literature in 3 languages but who lived in a tiny apartment and worked multiple jobs to survive. Their courtship had been modest by any standard, Grandfather Thomas had very little money while finishing his degree, and grandmother Elena had even less. But what they had discovered in each other was a compatibility of values, a shared belief that integrity and education and building something meaningful mattered more than material comfort or social status. When grandfather Thomas proposed marriage, he did so without a ring, apologizing that he could not yet afford to buy one but promising that he would work hard to provide a good life for them. Grandmother Elena had responded by showing him the ring her grandmother had given her, explaining its history and significance, and asking if he would accept it as her contribution to their engagement. She told him that this ring represented the values she wanted their marriage to embody, the principle of choosing substance over appearance, meaning over cost, connection to something larger than individual desire. She said that wearing her grandmother's ring would remind her daily of the women in her family who had built strong marriages based on respect and partnership, and that she could imagine no better symbol for beginning their life together. Grandfather Thomas had been moved by this gesture, and by the trust it represented. He accepted the ring and placed it on her finger, and they were married 3 months later in a simple ceremony at a local church with a handful of friends as witnesses. Their wedding had cost perhaps $100 total, but their marriage had lasted 62 years until my grandfather's death in 2011, characterized by mutual devotion, shared purpose, and the building of a life that honored both of their values. Throughout those decades, grandmother Elena had worn this ring every single day. She wore it while she worked as a translator, helping new immigrants navigate American systems and institutions. She wore it while she raised my father and his brother, teaching them to value education, integrity, and service to community. She wore it while she volunteered at museums and historical societies, sharing her expertise in Italian art and culture with institutions that could not afford to hire someone with her knowledge. She wore it while she and my grandfather lived modestly in their small house in Brookline, saving money not for luxury purchases but for their children's education and for the causes they believed in supporting. My father had grown up seeing his mother wear this ring, but like many children, he had probably never thought to ask about its history or significance. It was simply the ring his mother always wore, unremarkable in its familiarity. My mother, coming into the family from a different background with different values, had likely viewed the ring as old-fashioned and unimpressive, a relic of a less prosperous time that grandmother Elena could have replaced with something more contemporary if she had cared about such things. Lauren and I, as grandchildren, had both observed grandmother Elena wearing this ring during our childhood visits to her house, but we had processed that observation through completely different frameworks. Lauren had seen an old, plain ring that proved our grandmother was not fashionable or wealthy by modern standards. I had seen a ring that my grandmother touched gently, that she explained carried the memory of women she had loved, that she valued enough to wear daily despite its age and despite having other jewelry she could have chosen instead. The difference in how Lauren and I perceived grandmother Elena's ring reflected the deeper difference in how we had each related to our grandmother during her lifetime. Lauren had been bored by grandmother Elena's stories about Italy, about the war, about building a life in America. She had been impatient with our grandmother's careful attention to the history and craftsmanship of objects, viewing these interests as old-fashioned and irrelevant to modern life. When grandmother Elena tried to teach Lauren about recognizing quality or understanding provenance, Lauren had dismissed these lessons as unnecessary information that had no practical application in a world where new things could simply be purchased. I, conversely, had been fascinated by everything grandmother Elena wanted to share. I had listened to her stories about the palazzo in Verona, about the family's art collection, about the craftsmen and artists she had known, about the choices she had made during the war and after. I had learned from her how to look at a piece of furniture and recognize the joinery technique that indicated when and where it was made. I had studied with her how to examine paintings for the subtle indicators of authentic age versus artificial aging. I had absorbed her philosophy that the most valuable possessions were those that connected you to people and stories that mattered, not those that impressed strangers with their price tags. This divergence in how Lauren and I engaged with grandmother Elena's teaching had created a quiet but significant difference in our relationship with her during her final years. When grandmother Elena's health began declining, I had visited her regularly, bringing her books she wanted to read, sitting with her while she sorted through old photographs and documents, helping her write down stories and memories she wanted preserved. Lauren had visited dutifully but briefly, usually bringing expensive flowers or gourmet food that Grandmother Elena appreciated politely, but that clearly missed the point of what she actually needed, which was time and attention and genuine interest in what she had to say. During one of my visits about 6 months before Grandmother Elena died, she had asked me to help her go through her jewelry box and document which pieces should go to which family members after her death. This had been an emotionally difficult task, handling these objects that carried so much meaning for her, listening to the stories behind each piece, understanding that she was preparing for an ending that neither of us wanted to acknowledge directly. As we worked through the jewelry box together, Grandmother Elena had removed her engagement ring from her finger with some difficulty, the arthritis in her hands making the movement painful. She had held the ring in her palm, studying it in the afternoon light coming through her bedroom window, and had begun to tell me its complete history in more detail than she had ever shared before. She explained about Sophia choosing love over advantage, about the Venetian craftsman whose work was now museum quality, about the rarity of the Baroque pearl and the impossibility of finding its equal in modern markets. She told me about carrying the ring in her trunk from Italy, about offering it to my grandfather as her contribution to their engagement, about wearing it through 6 decades of marriage and family life. She talked about the women in our family who had worn this ring before her, and about the values it represented to her. Then she had placed the ring in my hand and closed my fingers around it. She told me that she wanted me to have this ring when the time came, not just to own it but to wear it when I found someone worthy of joining our family's story. She said she had watched how I approached the world, how I valued substance over surface, how I worked to preserve things that others might discard, how I chose meaning over convenience. She said this ring belonged with someone who understood what it represented, and she believed I was that person. I had tried to protest, suggesting that this ring should go to my father or that it should be divided somehow among all the grandchildren. But Grandmother Elena had been firm. She said my father had his own relationship with his parents' memory that did not require possessing their things, and that some objects belonged specifically with the people who would treasure them for the right reasons. She asked me to promise that I would wear the ring when I got engaged, and that I would not tell my parents or Lauren about this conversation unless circumstances made it necessary. The promise had felt strange at the time, almost like a test, but I had given it because Grandmother Elena had asked and because I trusted that her reasons were sound even if I did not fully understand them yet. Now, sitting at my family's dinner table with Lauren's mocking words still echoing in the room, I understood what my grandmother had known. She had understood that giving this ring to me would create exactly this kind of moment, where my different value system would be challenged by those who measured worth in dollars rather than meaning, and she had wanted to see whether I would defend what the ring represented or whether I would hide its significance to avoid conflict. When Grandmother Elena died 18 months ago, my father and uncle had gone through her house distributing possessions according to the detailed instructions she had left. Most items went to my parents or were divided among various family members, but there had been specific sealed letters for each grandchild containing instructions about particular items she wanted them to have. My letter had included directions to a safe deposit box, where she had placed the engagement ring along with complete documentation of its provenance and history. Inside that safe deposit box, I had found the ring carefully stored in its original antique case, along with a folder containing documentation that took my breath away. There were photographs of my great-great-great-grandmother Sophia wearing the ring on her wedding day in 1875. There were letters from Sophia to her daughter describing the ring's commission and the craftsman who created it. There were insurance appraisals from various decades showing the ring's escalating value as antique jewelry became increasingly sought after by collectors. There were authentication documents from experts in antique Italian jewelry, confirming the craftsman's mark and the natural origin of the Baroque pearl. Most significantly, there was a recent appraisal dated just 1 year before Grandmother Elena's death, conducted by Sotheby's auction house in New York. The document detailed the ring's characteristics, its provenance, its historical significance, and its estimated auction value of $3.2 million. The appraisal explained that the combination of documented 5-generation provenance, the rarity of natural Baroque pearls of this quality, the reputation of the Venetian craftsman, and the ring's excellent preservation made it an exceptionally desirable piece for serious collectors of antique jewelry. The Sotheby's appraiser had noted particular interest in the ring from collectors of natural pearls, explaining that Baroque pearls of this size, color, and iridescence from 19th-century Italian waters were essentially impossible to find in modern markets. Environmental changes and overharvesting had destroyed the conditions that produced such pearls, making existing examples increasingly valuable as they became recognized as unreplaceable rather than merely old-fashioned. Accompanying the appraisal was a personal letter from grandmother Elena, explaining why she had commissioned this documentation. She wrote that she wanted me to know the ring's monetary value not because that value mattered to her or should matter to me, but because living in a world that measured everything in dollars meant that sometimes you needed to be able to prove worth in those terms to be taken seriously. She said the ring's real value was in its history and meaning, but that the appraisal existed as a shield against those who would dismiss it as worthless simply because it did not conform to contemporary aesthetic preferences. She also wrote that she hoped I would never need to use the appraisal to defend the ring's worth, that the person I chose to marry would understand its significance without needing a price tag to validate it, and that my family would respect my choices without requiring monetary justification. But she acknowledged that the world did not always work according to her hopes, and so she was providing me with documentation that could end certain conversations if ending them became necessary for protecting what mattered. Reading that letter in the safe deposit box, I had cried for the loss of this woman who had understood me so completely, who had tried to prepare me for challenges she knew I would face, who had trusted me with something precious to her while also equipping me to defend it if needed. I had taken the ring and the documentation, had them carefully insured for their full appraised value, and had followed her instructions to tell no one about any of this unless circumstances required it. When Marcus and I began dating, I had not mentioned the ring's existence or my grandmother's instructions about it. Our relationship had developed naturally without the weight of expectations about eventual engagement or marriage. But as our connection deepened and as Marcus spent time with grandmother Elena during her final months, something had shifted. My grandmother had recognized in Marcus the qualities she valued, the character and integrity and genuine interest in things beyond surface appearance that made him right for me and for this family legacy. I learned later that during one of his visits to my grandmother, about 3 months before she died, she had asked Marcus directly about his intentions regarding me. He had told her honestly that he loved me and hoped eventually to ask me to marry him, but that he wanted to wait until the time felt right, and until he had something meaningful to offer. Grandmother Elena had told him that she had something she wanted him to consider offering when that time came, and she had shown him the ring and shared its complete history. Marcus told me afterward that he had been overwhelmed by the trust my grandmother was placing in him, and by the significance of what she was offering. He had promised her that if I accepted his proposal, he would honor the ring's history and its meaning, that he would never pressure me to replace it with something more contemporary or conventional, and that he would help me defend its value if others failed to recognize it. Grandmother Elena had given him the ring and all its documentation, had made him promise not to tell me about this conversation until after he proposed, and had apparently died content in the knowledge that this precious family heirloom would pass to someone who understood and appreciated it. When Marcus proposed and presented me with grandmother Elena's ring, I had been shocked and moved in equal measure. He explained about his conversation with my grandmother, about her trust in him, about the documentation she had provided. We had looked through the provenance papers and the Sotheby's appraisal together, marveling at the ring's monetary value while both understanding that its real worth had nothing to do with what collectors would pay for it. We had discussed whether to tell my family about the ring's provenance and value, and Marcus had deferred to my judgment since it was my family and my grandmother's request. I had decided to honor grandmother Elena's wish that the information remain private unless circumstances required its revelation. I wanted to see whether my family would respect my choice of this unconventional ring, based on my word that it was meaningful to me, without needing monetary validation to take it seriously. That decision had worked well until tonight, until Lauren's mockery and my mother's inadequate defense, and the broader family dynamic that allowed my sister to publicly humiliate me without consequences. Sitting at this dinner table, listening to Lauren call my grandmother's treasured possession costume jewelry from a gas station vending machine, watching my parents fail to shut down her cruelty, I recognized that circumstances now required the revelation my grandmother had anticipated and prepared me for. I looked around the table at my family members, seeing the curiosity and anticipation on their faces, as they waited for whatever information I was about to share. I saw my father's growing understanding that something significant had been happening with his mother that he had not fully grasped. I saw my mother's social anxiety about potential conflict combined with her ingrained tendency to prioritize appearance and monetary value. I saw Lauren's defensive uncertainty as she tried to maintain her confident facade, while suspecting she might have made a serious miscalculation. What I am about to show you, I said quietly but clearly, is information that Grandmother Elena specifically asked me to keep private unless circumstances made it necessary to reveal. She wanted me to value this ring for what it means rather than for what it costs, and she trusted me to make that distinction. But she also provided me with documentation that could prove the ring's worth in monetary terms, if that proof became necessary to protect its significance. Lauren's comments tonight have made that proof necessary. I picked up my phone and opened the secure folder containing photographs of the Sotheby's appraisal and provenance documentation. I held the phone so that everyone at the table could see the first image, which showed the official Sotheby's letterhead, and the beginning of the appraisal document with its estimate clearly visible. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. My father's face went pale as he leaned forward to read the screen more carefully. My mother gasped audibly, her hand rising to her mouth. Uncle James stood up from his chair to get a better view. Various cousins crowded closer, trying to see what had caused such a response. And Lauren, sitting directly across from me, stared at the phone screen with an expression of absolute horror, as the reality of what she had just mocked crystallized before her eyes. Her face flushed deep red, then went pale, then flushed again. Her hand trembled as she reached for her wine glass, nearly knocking it over before steadying it and taking a large swallow. $3.2 million, my father read aloud, his voice stunned. Elena, is this real? Is this actually an appraisal for your ring? It is real, I confirmed. Conducted by Sotheby's auction house 13 months before Grandmother Elena died, at her request. The ring has been in our family for 5 generations, commissioned in 1875 by my great-great-great-grandfather for his bride Sophia. The Baroque pearl is from waters that no longer produce such specimens, making it essentially irreplaceable. The craftsman was a master jeweler in Venice whose work now appears in museum collections. The complete provenance is documented across 150 years. I swiped through the additional images on my phone, showing the historical photographs, the letters, the authentication documents, the detailed description of the pearl's characteristics and the setting's craftsmanship. My family stared in shocked silence, processing this information that completely inverted their understanding of what they had been witnessing. The silence that followed my revelation stretched across several long seconds, as each person at the table processed what they had just learned. The elegant dining room that had moments before been filled with uncomfortable tension, now felt charged with a different energy entirely. A collective recalibration of understanding that rippled through the assembled family members like a wave moving through still water. My father was the first to speak, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and something that sounded like grief. My mother wore a $3 million ring every single day for 60 years, and I never knew. I never even thought to ask about it. He looked at me with an expression that conveyed both wonder at what I had just revealed and a painful recognition of what he had failed to understand about his own mother during her lifetime. I watched him struggle with this realization, seeing in his face the dawning awareness that his mother had been a far more complex and interesting person than he had fully appreciated. He had known the basic facts of her immigration from Italy, her marriage to his father, her work as a translator and museum consultant. But he had apparently never delved deeply into the world she had left behind, the treasures she had managed to preserve, or the sophisticated knowledge of art and antiquities that she possessed. His mother had been right there, willing to share these stories, and he had been too busy with his own life to truly listen. My mother's reaction was characteristically focused on the monetary aspect and the social implications of what had just been revealed. $3.2 million, she repeated, her voice faint with shock. Elena, why didn't you tell us? Why would you let people think you were wearing some inexpensive vintage piece when you're actually wearing something worth more than our house? The question perfectly encapsulated the difference in our value systems. My mother could not understand why anyone would choose to keep quiet about possessing something so valuable, because in her worldview, the entire purpose of having expensive things was for other people to know you had them. The idea that I might wear a multimillion-dollar ring without announcing its value to everyone I encountered was genuinely incomprehensible to her. Because grandmother Elena asked me not to, I replied simply. She wanted me to value the ring for its history and meaning, not for its price. She wanted to see whether I would treasure it for the right reasons, and whether the people around me would respect my choices without needing monetary validation to take them seriously. Uncle James, who had always been more thoughtful and less materialistic than some of our family members, nodded slowly as he absorbed this information. That sounds exactly like something Elena would do. She was always trying to teach us that real value and monetary value were not the same thing. I remember her trying to explain that to us when we were going through her house after she died, but I don't think most of us really understood what she meant. Aunt Patricia reached across the table to place her hand over mine, her eyes bright with emotion. Your grandmother would be so proud of you right now, Elena. You understood exactly what she was trying to teach, and you honored her wishes even when it would have been easier to just show everyone the appraisal and avoid criticism. But it was Lauren's reaction that commanded most of the table's attention. My sister sat frozen in her chair, her face cycling through shades of red and white as the full horror of what she had done settled over her. She had spent the past 30 minutes publicly mocking a ring worth approximately 100 times the value of her own diamond, calling it costume jewelry, suggesting it came from a gas station vending machine, and implying that Marcus was either too poor or too indifferent to buy me something of real value. Every cruel comment she had made, every dismissive gesture, every mocking laugh now hung in the air between us like physical objects that could not be retracted or unsaid. The entire family had witnessed her performance, had heard her compare her 3-carat diamond favorably to what she had assumed was a cheap antique, had listened to her suggest that I was settling for less because I could not command more. And now everyone at the table understood that she had been catastrophically, embarrassingly wrong. Brandon, sitting beside Lauren, looked like he desperately wished he could disappear. His face had gone red with second-hand embarrassment, and he was staring at his plate with the intensity of someone hoping that if he focused hard enough on the china pattern, he might be able to transport himself out of this situation through sheer force of will. Lauren's mouth opened and closed several times as she tried to formulate some response to what had been revealed, but no words emerged. What could she possibly say? An apology would be inadequate given the sustained nature of her attack. Trying to laugh it off would only make her appear more callous and unaware. Attempting to justify her comments would require her to admit that she had been making judgments about value based purely on appearance without knowledge, which would undermine her carefully cultivated image as someone with sophisticated taste and expertise in luxury goods. I watched her internal struggle with a mixture of emotions that I had not anticipated feeling. Part of me felt vindicated, even satisfied, that her cruelty had backfired so spectacularly. She had tried to humiliate me in front of our entire family, and instead she had humiliated herself. The poetic justice of the situation was undeniable, and I would be lying if I claimed I took no satisfaction in seeing her confronted with the consequences of her behavior. But another part of me, the part that my grandmother had cultivated through years of patient teaching about grace and perspective, felt something closer to sadness. This moment revealed so clearly how little Lauren had understood about what our grandmother had been trying to teach us. How completely she had missed the lessons about looking beneath surfaces and valuing substance over appearance. Grandmother Elena had tried to share her knowledge and values with both of us, but only one of us had been listening. I thought about the countless afternoons I had spent with grandmother Elena during my teenage years and 20s, listening to her stories about Italy, learning how to recognize quality in furniture and art and jewelry, absorbing her philosophy about what made life meaningful. During those same years, Lauren had been busy with activities that would enhance her resume and social status, viewing visits to our grandmother as obligations to be fulfilled rather than opportunities to be cherished. The divergence in how we had spent that time had created the divergence in how we understood the world, and that difference was now on full display at this dinner table. My father cleared his throat, clearly struggling to navigate this revelation and its implications. Elena, can you tell us more about the provenance documentation? How did your grandmother come to have all of this information authenticated? I appreciated the question because it gave me the opportunity to shift the conversation from Lauren's embarrassment to the actual history and significance of the ring. I explained that grandmother Elena had maintained meticulous records of all the family possessions she had managed to preserve and bring to America. For items of particular value or historical significance, she had periodically updated authentication and appraisal documentation as the market for antiques evolved and as scholarly understanding of various craftsmen and periods developed. The ring had been appraised several times over the decades, I continued, but the most recent Sotheby's appraisal had been conducted specifically at grandmother Elena's request about a year before she died. She had told the appraiser that she wanted comprehensive documentation for insurance purposes and for the benefit of whichever family member would eventually inherit the piece. The appraiser had been extremely enthusiastic about the ring, I explained, noting that pieces with such complete provenance and in such excellent condition were increasingly rare in the market. I swiped through the images on my phone, showing my family the photographs of my great-great-great-grandmother Sophia wearing the ring on her wedding day in 1875. The sepia-toned photograph showed a young woman in an elaborate Victorian wedding dress, her hand positioned deliberately to display the ring that her new husband had commissioned for her. The image connected our modern family gathering to a moment 150 years in the past, creating a tangible link across 5 generations of women who had worn this same piece of jewelry. Sophia chose to marry for love rather than advantage, I explained, sharing the story that grandmother Elena had told me. Her family had wanted her to accept a proposal from an aristocratic suitor who would have elevated their social position, but she chose instead to marry Antonio, a successful merchant who had integrity and intelligence but not noble blood. The ring was his gift to her, commissioned from the best craftsman he could find, using a pearl that was considered extraordinary even at that time. It represented his commitment to give her something of real value even though he could not give her a title or social elevation. Uncle James leaned forward, studying the photograph with interest. So this ring has been a symbol of choosing substance over status for 5 generations? That's extraordinary. That's exactly the kind of thing Elena would have loved, the idea of an object carrying a consistent meaning across time. I nodded, grateful for his understanding. Exactly. Each woman who wore this ring was told its story and understood what it represented. When grandmother Elena brought it to America in her trunk of preserved possessions, she was specifically choosing to save items that carried meaning and history, rather than items that simply had monetary value. She could have brought other pieces that would have been easier to sell for cash when she needed money, but she chose to preserve the things that connected her to her family's story. Aunt Caroline, who had been listening quietly, spoke up with a question that revealed she was beginning to understand the larger lesson in all of this. When Elena gave you this ring, was she testing whether you would understand its significance without needing to know its monetary value? In a way, yes, I confirmed. She wanted me to wear it and treasure it because of what it meant and what it represented, not because of what collectors would pay for it. She said the appraisal existed as a tool I could use if I needed to prove the ring's worth to people who only understood value in monetary terms, but she hoped I would never need to use it. She hoped the people around me would respect my choice of this ring based on my explanation of its personal significance. The implication was clear to everyone at the table. My grandmother's hope had not been fulfilled. Lauren had not respected my choice. My parents had not defended my explanation of the ring's sentimental value. The family had allowed my sister to publicly mock something precious to me without intervening to stop her cruelty. Grandmother Elena's test had revealed exactly what she had probably suspected it would reveal about who in our family understood what truly mattered, and who remained focused on surface appearances and monetary measurements. My mother shifted uncomfortably in her chair, apparently recognizing her own failure in this situation. Elena, I should have stopped Lauren earlier. I should have told her that even if your ring was inexpensive, her comments were inappropriate and hurtful. I'm sorry I didn't defend you properly. The apology was something, though it was undermined somewhat by the qualifier even if your ring was inexpensive, which suggested that my mother still believed expensive rings deserved more respect than inexpensive ones. But I appreciated the acknowledgement that she had failed to protect me from Lauren's attack, even if her reasoning for why she should have intervened was not quite aligned with what actually mattered. Thank you, Mom, I said quietly. But the larger issue is that Lauren's comments were inappropriate regardless of the ring's monetary value. If this ring had been worth $20 instead of $3 million, her mockery would have been equally cruel and her assumptions equally wrong. The problem is not that she misjudged the price. The problem is that she assumed price was the only thing that mattered, and that she felt entitled to publicly humiliate me based on that assumption. This distinction seemed to land with some family members better than others. Uncle James and Aunt Patricia nodded in clear agreement. My father looked thoughtful, apparently processing this perspective and recognizing its validity. My mother looked somewhat confused, still struggling to fully separate monetary value from actual worth. And Lauren remained silent, her face a mask of mortification and perhaps the beginning of genuine self-reflection. Marcus, who had been quietly supportive throughout this entire exchange, finally spoke up with a comment that redirected attention to grandmother Elena's wisdom. What strikes me most about this whole situation is how well Elena understood human nature. She knew that some people would dismiss this ring based on its appearance, and she knew that Elena would face criticism for wearing something unconventional. But she also knew that the right person would see past the surface to understand what the ring actually represented. She was giving Elena both a gift and a test, and she was giving everyone around Elena an opportunity to show whether they valued substance or just status. His observation created a moment of reflection around the table. Several family members nodded slowly, beginning to appreciate the sophisticated understanding my grandmother had possessed about the people around her, and about the values that different individuals held. She had not been naive about how her granddaughter's unconventional engagement ring would be received. She had anticipated exactly this kind of conflict, and she had prepared me for it by providing both the philosophical framework to defend my choice and the documentation to prove the ring's worth if that proof became necessary. I found myself thinking about other items in grandmother Elena's carefully preserved collection and other lessons she had tried to teach that had been received with varying levels of understanding by different family members. The ring was perhaps the most dramatic example because of its extraordinary monetary value combined with its modest appearance, but it was not the only instance of her trying to demonstrate that surface and substance could be dramatically different. I remembered afternoons spent with her going through her small collection of paintings and drawings, learning to distinguish between works that were decorative but unremarkable, and works that showed genuine artistic skill and historical significance. Some of the paintings that looked most impressive at first glance because of their size or bright colors were actually of minimal value and limited skill. Meanwhile, some small sketches that could easily be overlooked were actually preliminary studies by recognized masters, worth far more than the large decorative pieces but requiring educated eyes to recognize their significance. Grandmother Elena had used these objects as teaching tools, showing me and occasionally other grandchildren who expressed interest how to look carefully, how to research provenance, how to understand the difference between something made by a skilled craftsman and something mass-produced, how to recognize authenticity versus artificial aging. She had treated these lessons as important knowledge that should be passed down through generations, practical skills that would serve us well in navigating a world full of surface appearances that concealed varying degrees of substance. But these lessons had only been absorbed by those family members who were willing to invest the time and attention required to learn them. Lauren had never been interested in spending hours examining old paintings, or discussing the history of furniture construction, or learning how to authenticate antique jewelry. She had viewed these interests as old-fashioned and irrelevant, preferring to focus on contemporary luxury goods, whose value was clearly marked by brand names and price tags. The irony that Lauren worked in luxury retail, supposedly as an expert in valuable goods, while completely failing to recognize an extraordinarily valuable antique piece was not lost on me. Her expertise was limited to items whose value was established by marketing and branding, rather than by intrinsic quality or historical significance. She could tell you the exact retail price of any designer handbag or watch currently on the market, but she could not recognize a masterpiece of 19th-century Italian craftsmanship when it was sitting directly in front of her. This limitation in Lauren's knowledge and perception extended beyond jewelry to her broader approach to life. She measured everything by external markers of success, rather than internal qualities of character or achievement. She valued Brandon not primarily for who he was as a person but for the lifestyle he could provide and the image they projected as a couple. She had chosen her career not because she was passionate about retail or customer service, but because it gave her access to luxury goods and wealthy clients. She selected friends based on their social connections and financial status, rather than on shared values or genuine compatibility. I thought about how differently grandmother Elena had approached these same questions of value and worth. She had chosen to marry grandfather Thomas not because he could offer her material security or social advancement, but because he was intelligent, kind, hardworking, and shared her values. She had chosen her career as a translator and museum consultant, not because it paid well, but because it allowed her to use her knowledge in service of helping others and preserving cultural heritage. She had selected friends based on intellectual compatibility and mutual respect, rather than on what they could offer her socially or financially. The ring I wore represented these choices and these values. It was beautiful not because it conformed to current fashion, but because it had been crafted with extraordinary skill by someone who cared about creating something excellent. It was valuable not primarily because of its price but because it connected me to 5 generations of women who had chosen love over advantage, meaning over status, substance over surface. Wearing it reminded me daily of who I wanted to be, and what I wanted to prioritize in my own life. As these reflections moved through my mind, I became aware that the conversation at the dinner table had continued around me. Various family members were asking questions about the ring's history, about the Venetian craftsman who created it, about the Baroque pearl's unusual characteristics, about how grandmother Elena had managed to preserve it through the war and her immigration to America. The questions revealed genuine interest and a growing appreciation for the ring's significance beyond its monetary value. But Lauren remained conspicuously silent. She had not asked a single question about the ring's history or meaning. She had not apologized for her comments. She sat in her chair looking devastated, occasionally lifting her wine glass to her lips with a trembling hand, her eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance as though she could not bear to look at the ring or at me or at any of the family members who had witnessed her spectacular miscalculation. I found myself facing a choice about how to respond to Lauren's obvious distress. Part of me wanted to simply let her sit in her discomfort, to allow the natural consequences of her cruelty to unfold without intervention. She had tried to humiliate me publicly, and the fact that her attack had backfired was arguably appropriate justice. Why should I do anything to ease her embarrassment when she had shown no concern for my feelings while she was mocking my ring and my engagement? But another part of me recognized that this moment was about more than just Lauren getting what she deserved. This was an opportunity for teaching and growth, for demonstrating the values that grandmother Elena had worked so hard to instill. My grandmother would not have reveled in Lauren's humiliation, even if that humiliation was self-inflicted and arguably deserved. She would have used this moment to help Lauren understand what she had been missing, to show her gently but firmly that there was another way of seeing and valuing the world. I thought about what grandmother Elena would do if she were here at this table, witnessing this conflict between her granddaughters. She would not have been pleased with Lauren's behavior, certainly. She would have been disappointed by the cruelty and the materialism and the complete failure to understand what the ring represented. But she also would have recognized this moment as a potential turning point, an opportunity for Lauren to finally grasp something she had been missing throughout her life. The question was whether Lauren was capable of that kind of growth and self-reflection, whether she could move past her embarrassment to actually learn something from this experience. That would depend partly on how I chose to handle the next moments of this conversation, whether I would grind her humiliation deeper, or whether I would offer her a path toward understanding and redemption. Before I could decide how to proceed, my father spoke up with a question that shifted the focus in a new direction. Elena, when Marcus proposed with this ring, did he know about its value and history? Or was he as surprised as we are right now? The question gave me an opening to bring Marcus more fully into the conversation, and to share the beautiful story of how grandmother Elena had entrusted him with this family treasure. I explained about the visits Marcus had made to grandmother Elena during her final months, about their conversations about art and history and immigration, about the relationship they had built independent of his connection to me. Grandmother Elena recognized in Marcus someone who understood the difference between price and value, I said, looking at my fiancé with affection and gratitude. She trusted him with the ring and all its documentation months before he actually proposed. She asked him to offer it to me when the time felt right, and she made him promise that he would help me defend its significance if others failed to recognize it. Marcus squeezed my hand under the table and added his own perspective to the story. Elena was one of the most remarkable people I've ever met. She treated me like family from the moment we were introduced. and she shared stories and knowledge with me that I will treasure for the rest of my life. When she gave me this ring and explained its history, I was overwhelmed by the trust she was placing in me. I promised her I would honor that trust by helping Elena understand what the ring represented and by supporting her choice to wear it regardless of what anyone else thought. Uncle James raised his wine glass in an impromptu toast. To Elena Castellano, who understood more about value than most of us ever will, and who trusted these young people to carry forward the lessons she tried to teach. And to Elena and Marcus, who clearly learned those lessons well. The gesture created a moment of warmth and family solidarity that helped ease some of the tension that had dominated the evening. Various family members raised their glasses and echoed the sentiment, offering congratulations and expressing admiration for both the ring and the values it represented. The atmosphere in the dining room shifted from confrontational to celebratory, or at least moved in that direction. But even as I acknowledged the toast and accepted the congratulations, my attention kept returning to Lauren, who had not raised her glass and who continued to sit in apparent misery. The evening had started as a celebration of my engagement, had devolved into my sister's cruel mockery of my ring, and had transformed into a revelation that completely inverted everyone's understanding of the situation. The emotional whiplash was affecting everyone at the table, but it was clearly affecting Lauren most of all. I realized that we had reached a critical juncture in how this evening would conclude, and what its lasting impact would be on family relationships. I could allow the celebration to continue without addressing Lauren's behavior directly, letting the natural consequences of her actions serve as punishment and lesson. Or I could create space for a conversation that might be painful, but could potentially lead to genuine understanding and growth. The choice would determine not just how this particular dinner ended, but how my relationship with my sister would proceed into the future. The toast had created a temporary reprieve from the tension, a moment where the family could unite around something positive, rather than dwelling on the conflict that had erupted. As glasses were raised and congratulations offered, I found myself observing the scene with a strange sense of detachment, as though I were watching from outside myself rather than participating directly in the celebration. The emotional intensity of the past hour had left me feeling simultaneously vindicated and exhausted, satisfied that the truth had emerged but uncertain about what should happen next. Marcus leaned close to me and spoke quietly enough that only I could hear. "Are you okay? This has been quite an evening." His concern was genuine and grounding, reminding me that beyond all the family drama and the revelation about the ring, the fundamental reality was that I was engaged to someone who loved me and understood me. That truth mattered more than Lauren's embarrassment or my parents' belated recognition of what they had failed to appreciate about their own mother. I nodded and whispered back, "I'm okay. Just processing everything." I never actually wanted to use that appraisal to prove anything. I wish Lauren had just respected my choice without needing monetary validation. The regret in my voice surprised me slightly. Despite my satisfaction at having defended the ring's significance, I recognized that I had hoped for a different outcome, one where my family simply trusted that I had made a meaningful choice, even if they did not fully understand it. As the conversations around the table resumed, breaking into smaller groups discussing various aspects of what had been revealed, I found myself reflecting on the past several months and recognizing warning signs that I had noticed but not fully processed about Lauren's increasingly competitive and materialistic behavior. The evening's confrontation had not emerged from nowhere. It was the culmination of patterns that had been building for years, but had intensified significantly since Lauren's own engagement to Brandon 6 months earlier. I thought back to the day Lauren had announced her engagement, remembering how the celebration had immediately centered not on the relationship or the commitment but on the ring itself. Lauren had practically led with photographs of the diamond, posting them to social media before even calling our parents to share the news that she was engaged. When she finally did call, the conversation had focused extensively on the ring's specifications. 3 carats, flawless clarity, platinum setting, custom design from a private jeweler whose name she mentioned repeatedly, as though his reputation was as important as Brandon's proposal itself. At the time, I had attributed Lauren's focus on the ring to simple excitement about a beautiful piece of jewelry. Engagement rings were significant purchases, after all, and many people took pleasure in selecting or receiving something lovely. But looking back with the perspective provided by tonight's events, I could see that Lauren's obsession with her ring had gone beyond normal appreciation into something more troubling. She had treated the ring as proof of her worth and Brandon's devotion, as though the amount of money he spent directly correlated to the depth of his love and her value as a person. In the months following her engagement, Lauren had found ways to work her ring into nearly every conversation we had. If we were discussing weekend plans, she would mention how the sunlight made her diamond sparkle beautifully during brunch. If we were talking about work, she would note how clients at her luxury retail store constantly complimented her ring. If we were having a completely unrelated discussion about books or movies or current events, Lauren would somehow steer the conversation back to her engagement ring and the admiration it generated. I had found this pattern tiresome but had not recognized it as a symptom of a deeper issue with how Lauren measured value and self-worth. Now, sitting at this dinner table having just revealed that my supposedly modest ring was worth exponentially more than hers, I understood that Lauren's obsession with her diamond had been driven by profound insecurity about whether she was valuable enough, loved enough, successful enough. The ring had become her talisman against those doubts, physical proof that she mattered, and that someone was willing to invest significantly in her. This insight made me view Lauren's attack on my ring in a different light. She had not been primarily motivated by cruelty toward me, though the cruelty had certainly been present. Instead, she had been threatened by my apparent contentment with something she perceived as inferior. My willingness to wear an old-fashioned, modest-looking ring challenged her entire framework for understanding worth and value. If I could be happy with what appeared to be a simple antique piece, what did that say about her need for a large, expensive, obviously new diamond? If meaning and history mattered more than price and size, had she been measuring the wrong things all along? I recalled a conversation Lauren and I had shared about 2 months after her engagement, during a rare lunch together where she had seemed more vulnerable than usual. She had mentioned feeling pressure about wedding planning, about managing Brandon's expectations and our mother's opinions and the judgments of friends who were comparing her choices to other weddings they had attended. At one point, she had said something that had struck me as oddly revealing at the time but that I had not fully processed. "At least I have the ring to prove that this is real and serious," she had said, twisting the diamond on her finger to catch the light. "When people see this ring, they know that Brandon is committed, that this is not just some casual relationship. The ring validates everything." I had been troubled by the comment because it suggested that Lauren needed external validation of her relationships, worth rather than being confident in the relationship itself. But I had not pursued the conversation further, had not asked what insecurities were driving her need for that validation. Instead, I had made some generic supportive comment and allowed the subject to change. Now I wondered whether pressing that conversation might have revealed depths of uncertainty in Lauren that could have been addressed before they manifested in tonight's cruelty. Beyond the obsession with her own ring, I recognized other warning signs about Lauren's values and priorities that had become increasingly apparent over the past year. Her relationship with Brandon seemed to be based heavily on lifestyle compatibility, rather than deeper emotional connection. When Lauren talked about Brandon, she focused on where they went together, what they bought, how they were perceived by others. She rarely mentioned conversations they had about meaningful topics, shared values they discovered, vulnerabilities they revealed to each other, or ways they supported each other through difficulties. Their relationship appeared to exist primarily in the performance of being a successful couple, rather than in the private reality of building a life together. Lauren posted constantly on social media about expensive restaurants they visited, designer purchases Brandon made for her, weekend trips to fashionable destinations. The curated image of their relationship looked impressive and enviable, but I had always wondered what existed beneath that polished surface, what they actually talked about when the cameras were not recording and the audience was not watching. In contrast, my relationship with Marcus had developed largely away from social media and public performance. We had shared interests in historical preservation, documentary filmmaking, and the kinds of long conversations about ideas and values that did not translate well to Instagram posts. We had spent time visiting old buildings I was working to preserve, watching documentaries about subjects we found interesting, cooking together in our gradually renovating loft, and talking for hours about everything from our childhoods to our hopes for the future. The relationship was grounded in genuine compatibility and mutual understanding, rather than in external markers of success. I suspected that this difference in how Marcus and I approached our relationship versus how Lauren and Brandon approached theirs had contributed to Lauren's defensive hostility about the engagement rings. Her relationship looked more impressive from the outside with its expensive dinners and luxury purchases, but my relationship was probably more substantial in the ways that actually mattered for long-term compatibility. The rings became symbols of these different approaches, with Lauren's large diamond representing external validation and performance, while my antique heirloom represented internal meaning and historical connection. Another warning sign I had noticed but not fully appreciated was Lauren's relationship with our parents, particularly our mother. Victoria had always favored Lauren to some degree, relating more easily to her conventional choices and material focus than to my unconventional interests and values. But in recent years, as Lauren had pursued increasingly expensive lifestyle choices, our mother had become almost a co-conspirator in validating those choices, encouraging Lauren's materialism and supporting her belief that expensive things proved worth and success. When Lauren bought her luxury apartment, our mother had thrown her a housewarming party and repeatedly mentioned the prestigious address and high-end finishes to everyone who attended. When Lauren traded in her car for a more expensive European model, our mother had posted photos on social media and made comments about how successful Lauren must be to afford such a vehicle. When Lauren got engaged and showed off her diamond ring, our mother had immediately called all her friends to describe its size and quality, treating it as a personal achievement that reflected well on her parenting. This maternal validation had reinforced Lauren's materialistic value system, confirming for her that expensive possessions proved worth, and that external markers of success were what mattered most. Our mother had never shown the same enthusiasm for my achievements in historical preservation, or my graduate degree in restoration architecture, or my success in building a career I found meaningful. Those accomplishments did not translate as easily into social bragging rights, so they received polite acknowledgement but not the effusive celebration that Lauren's material acquisitions generated. I realized that tonight's dinner had probably been particularly difficult for our mother, because it forced her to confront the limitations of the value system she had been promoting. She had spent years encouraging both daughters to measure worth in monetary terms, and that framework had just spectacularly failed when applied to my grandmother's ring. The modest-looking antique she had probably viewed as inadequate was actually worth more than her house, more than both daughters' cars combined, more than anything else our family owned. The embarrassment of having misjudged so completely must have been significant. Yet another warning sign had been Lauren's relationship with grandmother Elena during the final years of our grandmother's life. While I had visited regularly and spent time listening to stories and learning about the family's history, Lauren had visited dutifully but briefly, treating these visits as obligations rather than opportunities. She had brought expensive gifts that grandmother Elena accepted graciously, but that clearly missed the mark of what our grandmother actually wanted, which was time and attention and genuine interest. I remembered one particular visit about 8 months before grandmother Elena died, when Lauren and I had both been at her small house at the same time. Grandmother Elena had been showing us some of the paintings from her preserved collection, explaining the history of each piece and the circumstances under which it had been created or acquired. I had been fascinated, asking questions about the artists and techniques and historical context. Lauren had been checking her phone repeatedly, clearly bored and eager to leave. At one point, grandmother Elena had gently confronted Lauren's inattention, asking whether she found these stories interesting, or whether she would prefer to discuss something else. Lauren had responded with transparent impatience, saying that old paintings were fine but that she was more interested in contemporary art and modern design. She had suggested that maybe grandmother Elena should consider selling some of these old pieces, and using the money to buy something more current and relevant to today's aesthetic. The suggestion had been innocent enough on its surface, but it had revealed so completely how Lauren failed to understand what these objects meant to our grandmother. These were not simply decorative items that could be replaced with more fashionable alternatives. They were physical connections to people grandmother Elena had loved, to a world that had been destroyed, to a life she had lost and mourned for 7 decades. The idea of selling them to buy something more contemporary was not just impractical, it was a fundamental misunderstanding of their significance. Grandmother Elena had responded with remarkable patience, explaining that these items were irreplaceable, not because of their monetary value, but because of their personal meaning. She had tried once again to teach Lauren the lesson she had been attempting to impart for years, that some things mattered because of their history and connections rather than because of their price or fashionability. Lauren had nodded politely but had clearly not internalized the lesson, treating it as another example of old-fashioned thinking that did not apply to modern life. Sitting at tonight's dinner table, watching Lauren process the revelation about my ring's true value, I wondered whether she was finally beginning to understand what grandmother Elena had been trying to teach. The humiliation she was experiencing was certainly painful, but pain could be instructive if it led to genuine reflection and growth. The question was whether Lauren would use this experience to reconsider her assumptions about value and worth, or whether she would simply feel embarrassed about having misjudged this particular ring, without examining the broader framework that had led to that misjudgment. I also reflected on my own role in allowing tonight's situation to develop as it had. I had honored grandmother Elena's request to keep the ring's provenance and value private, but I had also known that doing so would likely lead to exactly the kind of misunderstanding and mockery that had occurred. I could have prevented Lauren's embarrassment by simply being upfront about the ring's history and value from the beginning, showing my family the documentation when I first announced my engagement and preempting any criticism about the ring's appearance. But choosing that path would have undermined what grandmother Elena was trying to teach through this test. She wanted to know whether I would value the ring for its meaning rather than its price, and she wanted to see whether my family would respect my choices without needing monetary justification. Revealing the appraisal immediately would have prevented the test from occurring, would have allowed everyone to continue operating within a framework where expensive things deserved respect and cheaper things did not. By keeping the information private until Lauren's mockery forced the revelation, I had allowed grandmother Elena's test to play out as designed. The results were illuminating if painful. Lauren had failed the test spectacularly, revealing that she measured worth purely in monetary terms and felt entitled to mock what she perceived as inferior. My parents had failed the test more quietly, neither defending my choice nor questioning Lauren's cruel commentary until the monetary value was revealed. Other family members had mostly remained neutral, uncomfortable with the conflict but unwilling to intervene. Only Marcus had passed the test unambiguously, seeing the ring's value from the beginning because grandmother Elena had trusted him with its history. And perhaps Uncle James and Aunt Patricia had passed as well, showing respect for my choice even before they knew the ring's worth and immediately understanding the larger lesson when the truth was revealed. These reflections brought me back to the present moment and the question of how to proceed with the remainder of this evening. The dinner that was meant to celebrate my engagement had become a complicated referendum on family values, material worth versus personal meaning, and the legacies we inherit from previous generations. The food had grown cold on our plates, barely touched during the intense conversations that had dominated the meal. The celebration had been derailed by conflict and revelation, and now we all sat in the aftermath trying to determine what came next. I looked at my father, seeing in his expression a mixture of emotions that suggested he was processing multiple realizations simultaneously. He was confronting the fact that he had not fully known or appreciated his own mother's sophistication and knowledge. He was recognizing that one daughter had built a relationship with his mother that he himself had never quite achieved. He was witnessing conflict between his children that revealed fundamental differences in their values and characters. And he was perhaps questioning his own role in creating or perpetuating the family dynamics that had led to this moment. My mother appeared primarily concerned with salvaging the social situation and restoring some sense of normalcy to the evening. She kept glancing between Lauren and me, clearly wanting to smooth over the conflict, but uncertain about how to do so without either dismissing the seriousness of what had occurred or making Lauren feel worse about her behavior. Her discomfort was palpable, and I recognized that she was struggling with the revelation that her preferred framework for understanding value had just been demonstrated to be inadequate. Marcus remained quietly supportive beside me, his presence a reminder that whatever family drama was unfolding, I had chosen a partner who understood and shared the values that mattered to me. His earlier interactions with grandmother Elena and his willingness to honor her wishes about the ring had proven his character in ways that went far beyond tonight's specific conflict. I felt grateful for his steady presence and his patience with my complicated family dynamics. But it was Lauren who commanded most of my attention and concern. My sister sat motionless in her chair, her face still showing the shock and humiliation of having her cruelty backfire so completely. She had not spoken since the revelation about the ring's value, had not asked any questions or offered any comments or attempted any defense of her behavior. Her silence suggested she was experiencing something more profound than simple embarrassment, possibly a fundamental questioning of assumptions she had held without examination for her entire adult life. I found myself at a crossroads in deciding how to engage with Lauren's obvious distress. The vindictive part of me wanted to let her sit in her discomfort without intervention, allowing the natural consequences of her cruelty to serve as punishment and hopefully as motivation for future behavior change. She had deliberately tried to humiliate me in front of our entire family, had mocked something precious to me without any consideration for my feelings, and had revealed her own materialistic values in the most unflattering way possible. Why should I do anything to ease the pain she was experiencing as a result of her own choices? But the part of me that had absorbed Grandmother Elena's teachings about grace and compassion recognized that this moment represented an opportunity for something more constructive than simple retribution. My grandmother would not have wanted me to grind Lauren's humiliation deeper, even if that humiliation was deserved. Instead, she would have encouraged me to use this moment to help Lauren understand what she had been missing, to show her that there was another way of seeing and valuing the world beyond the materialistic framework she had adopted. The question was whether Lauren was capable of receiving that kind of teaching in her current emotional state, and whether any words I offered would be heard as genuine attempts at connection or as further humiliation disguised as help. The balance between holding Lauren accountable for her cruelty and offering her a path toward growth and understanding was delicate, and I was uncertain about how to navigate it effectively. As I sat contemplating these questions, I became aware that the conversations around the table had quieted somewhat, with various family members glancing between Lauren and me as though waiting to see what would happen next. The evening had reached a natural pause point, a moment where someone needed to say or do something that would determine whether we could salvage any celebration from this difficult situation, or whether the dinner would simply end in awkward dissolution with everyone retreating to process privately what had occurred. I made my decision, choosing to follow what I believed Grandmother Elena would have wanted rather than what my wounded pride might have preferred. I would create space for a conversation with Lauren that acknowledged the harm she had caused, while also offering her the opportunity to understand why her behavior had been problematic, beyond simply misjudging monetary value. Whether she could receive that offering in the spirit it was intended remained to be seen, but I owed it to my grandmother's memory, and to the possibility of a healthier sibling relationship in the future to at least try. I set my phone down on the table and took a slow breath, preparing to shift the conversation in a direction that might offer Lauren an opportunity for genuine understanding, rather than simply leaving her to marinate in her embarrassment. The role I was about to step into felt uncomfortable and uncertain, requiring me to balance honesty about the harm she had caused with compassion for the insecurity and confusion that had driven her behavior. Before I could speak, however, my mother intervened with a suggestion that revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of what this moment required. "Well, now that we have cleared up the confusion about the ring, perhaps we can move on to more pleasant topics," Victoria said brightly, her voice carrying the forced cheerfulness of someone desperate to restore normalcy to a situation that had veered far from her comfort zone. "Elena, why don't you and Marcus tell us about your wedding plans? Have you selected a date yet? Are you thinking of a large celebration or something more intimate?" The suggestion was so transparently an attempt to avoid addressing the real issues at hand that several people at the table shifted uncomfortably. My mother's instinct when faced with conflict had always been to smooth it over quickly and redirect attention to safer subjects, preferably ones that allowed her to plan and organize and exercise control. She did not want to sit with the discomfort of what had just occurred, or to allow space for the difficult conversations that genuine resolution would require. But more problematically, my mother's intervention positioned her as a protector of Lauren's feelings, rather than as someone holding Lauren accountable for her cruelty. By rushing to change the subject before Lauren had acknowledged her behavior or offered any apology, my mother was essentially communicating that Lauren's embarrassment was more important than my hurt, that family harmony mattered more than addressing harmful behavior, that we should all pretend the past hour had not happened rather than dealing with its implications. This pattern was deeply familiar from our childhood. When Lauren had been cruel or dismissive toward me as children, our mother had often responded by redirecting rather than correcting, suggesting that both girls should just be nice to each other rather than specifically addressing Lauren's aggression or my hurt. The result had been that Lauren never faced meaningful consequences for her behavior toward me. While I learned that my feelings were less important than maintaining surface-level family peace, I recognized that if I allowed my mother's redirection to succeed, we would simply perpetuate this dysfunctional pattern into our adult lives. Lauren would escape this situation having learned only that she had misjudged the monetary value of one specific ring, not that her entire approach to measuring worth was fundamentally flawed. Our relationship would continue to be characterized by her competitive materialism and my resigned tolerance of it. And the lesson grandmother Elena had tried to teach through this ring would be lost in a rush to restore comfortable superficiality. Actually, Mom, I think there are some things that need to be said before we move on to wedding planning, I replied quietly but firmly. What happened tonight was not simply a confusion or misunderstanding. Lauren made a deliberate choice to publicly mock my engagement ring and to question Marcus's commitment and financial capability based on assumptions about the ring's worth. That behavior was hurtful and inappropriate regardless of whether her assumptions about the ring's value were accurate. My mother's face tightened with displeasure at my refusal to let the matter drop. She opened her mouth to respond, probably to make another attempt at redirection or to minimize what had occurred. But my father interrupted before she could speak. Elena is right, Victoria, Robert said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he had perfected during 3 decades as a high school principal. Lauren's comments were out of line, and we should not pretend otherwise just because the situation has become uncomfortable. Our daughter was cruel to her sister at what was supposed to be a celebration, and that needs to be addressed. The intervention from my father was unexpected and significant. Robert had spent most of my childhood remaining somewhat passive in family conflicts, allowing Victoria to manage the emotional dynamics of our household, while he focused on his career and broader responsibilities. His willingness to step forward now and support my position over my mother's preference for conflict avoidance represented a departure from established patterns, one that seemed to surprise my mother as much as it did me. Lauren finally looked up from her intense examination of her plate, her eyes moving between our parents as she registered this shift in family dynamics. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, she was not being immediately protected from the consequences of her behavior by our mother's reflexive defense. The realization appeared to deepen her distress, but it also created the possibility that she might actually have to engage with what she had done rather than simply being rescued from discomfort. Brandon, sitting beside Lauren, looked profoundly uncomfortable with the direction this conversation was taking. He had been essentially silent throughout the entire evening, offering no defense of Lauren's behavior but also no criticism of it, simply existing in a state of visible wish that he were anywhere else. His passivity was revealing in its own way, suggesting either that he agreed with Lauren's materialistic values and saw nothing problematic in her comments, or that he lacked the courage to challenge her even when she was clearly in the wrong. I thought about how different Marcus's response had been when Lauren had attacked my ring. Marcus had immediately moved to defend both me and the ring's significance, had articulated clearly why Lauren's comments were inappropriate, had positioned himself firmly on my side even when doing so meant confronting my sister at a family gathering. The contrast between Marcus's active support and Brandon's passive observation told me something important about the respective strength and health of our two relationships. I think we need to talk about why what happened tonight was so problematic, I continued, looking directly at Lauren for the first time since revealing the ring's true value. And I do not mean just the fact that you misjudged how much my ring was worth. I mean the underlying assumptions and values that led you to think it was acceptable to publicly mock what you perceived as an inexpensive engagement ring. Lauren's face flushed again, but this time there was a flicker of something besides pure embarrassment in her expression. It might have been defensiveness or anger, or perhaps the beginning of genuine self-reflection. She remained silent, but her attention was fully focused on me now, waiting to hear what I would say next. When you called my ring costume jewelry from a gas station vending machine, when you suggested that Marcus either could not afford or did not care enough to buy me something better, when you made jokes about my wearing a hand-me-down engagement ring, you were operating from a belief system that measures love and commitment in dollars spent, I said, keeping my voice level and calm despite the emotion underneath the words. You genuinely believe that the amount of money a man spends on an engagement ring directly correlates to how much he values the woman he is marrying. That belief system is what allowed you to feel entitled to judge my engagement and Marcus's worth based on what you thought this ring had cost. I paused to let that observation settle before continuing. But here is the fundamental problem with that belief system, Lauren. If love and commitment can be measured in dollars, then they can also be bought with dollars. If a 3-carat diamond proves Brandon loves you more than a Baroque pearl proves Marcus loves me, then anyone with more money than Brandon could prove they love you even more by buying you a larger diamond. Your worth becomes tied to market values that have nothing to do with who you actually are as a person or what you bring to a relationship beyond your ability to inspire expensive purchases. The words were harsh but necessary, articulating what I had been thinking about Lauren's values for years, but had never directly confronted. I watched her process this observation, saw the initial defensive reaction followed by something that might have been the beginning of uncomfortable recognition that what I was saying contained truth she had been avoiding. Uncle James, who had been listening intently to this exchange, added his perspective in a way that supported my point without piling onto Lauren's distress. Your grandmother Elena used to talk about this exact issue. She said that one of the dangers of measuring everything in monetary terms was that it reduced all value to a single dimension that could always be exceeded. She said that real value existed in things that were irreplaceable rather than things that were expensive, because irreplaceable meant that no amount of money could create a substitute. The invocation of grandmother Elena's wisdom brought the conversation back to the source of these competing value systems. My grandmother had understood that her 2 granddaughters were developing very different approaches to understanding worth, and she had tried through teaching and example to show both of us that some things mattered beyond their price tags. The ring I wore represented her attempt to transmit those values forward, to create a physical reminder that meaning and connection were more valuable than market rates and monetary measurements. Aunt Patricia, Uncle James's wife, contributed her own reflection that added another dimension to the conversation. I remember when James and I got engaged 30 years ago, and Elena took me aside to show me some of the pieces she had brought from Italy. She told me that when everything else had been lost during the war, the items she managed to preserve were not the most expensive things her family owned but the things that carried the most meaning. She said that crisis revealed what people truly valued, because when you could only save a small fraction of your possessions, you discovered what actually mattered to you beyond monetary worth. The story created a contemplative silence around the table, as family members absorbed this perspective. The image of young Elena Marchetti selecting what to save from the ruins of her family's palazzo, choosing meaning over market value under the most desperate circumstances imaginable, provided powerful context for understanding why she had worn this particular ring for 6 decades despite having access to other jewelry that might have been more fashionable or obviously impressive. I built on Aunt Patricia's contribution by explaining more about what grandmother Elena had told me regarding her choices about what to preserve and bring to America. She said that she could have filled her trunk with small valuable items that would have been easy to sell for cash when she arrived in the United States. She knew antique dealers who would have paid well for certain pieces of jewelry or small artworks that were portable and marketable. But she chose instead to save things that connected her to the people and the world she was losing. Photographs that had no monetary value, but that preserved faces and memories. Letters that told her family's story. Objects like this ring that had been worn and loved by women she had known and admired. I looked around the table at my family members, seeing varying degrees of understanding and appreciation in their faces. Grandmother Elena spent her entire life trying to teach us that worth and price are not the same thing, that the most valuable possessions are often those that money cannot buy because they carry irreplaceable meaning and connection. This ring is valuable in monetary terms because collectors recognize its rarity and historical significance. But its real value to me has nothing to do with what Sotheby's would sell it for at auction. Its value is that it connects me to 5 generations of women who chose substance over status, meaning over materialism, love over advantage. Marcus squeezed my hand under the table, offering silent support and encouragement. I could feel the emotional weight of what I was trying to articulate, the attempt to explain a value system that seemed self-evident to me, but that clearly remained foreign and confusing to others at this table, particularly to Lauren. My sister had been listening to this extended explanation with an expression that was difficult to interpret. The initial shock and humiliation had faded somewhat, replaced by something more complicated that combined defensiveness, confusion, and perhaps the uncomfortable stirring of genuine reflection. She had spent her entire adult life building an identity around material success and external validation, and what I was describing challenged the foundation of that identity. But how do you measure worth if not by what things cost? Lauren asked suddenly, her voice smaller and more uncertain than I had heard it in years. The question was not rhetorical or defensive but genuinely confused, as though I had suggested navigating without a map or compass, and she could not imagine how one would determine direction without the familiar tools she had always relied upon. The question revealed how deeply Lauren had internalized a purely monetary framework for understanding value. She literally could not conceive of how to evaluate an engagement ring, or almost anything else without reference to its price. The idea that meaning, history, craftsmanship, personal connection, or emotional significance might be valid measures of worth seemed to be genuinely foreign to her thinking. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.